We turn now to the leaders of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. From New Jersey, Chairman Robert Menendez, and from Tennessee, the top Republican, Bob Corker. Well, gentlemen, now we not only have the Crimean referendum where voters there will certainly vote to break away from Ukraine. We now also have this incursion across the Crimean border, 6 miles further into Ukraine. Senator Menendez, how far do you expect Vladimir Putin to go?
Well, President Putin has started a game of Russian roulette, and I think that the United States and the West have to be very clear in their response, because he will calculate about how far he can go. So that means having very robust sanctions ready to go, starting with the Crimea vote and moving onwards depending upon Russia's continued actions after the Crimea vote.
Senator Corker, we'll get to the sanctions in a moment, but in addition to the steps that we've already talked about, the Russians have thousands, some say tens of thousands of troops massed along the border of eastern Ukraine in Russian territory. What do you expect Putin to do there?
Well, as was mentioned, I think that would be a major game changer, and hopefully that's not going to take place. I think it's a show of intimidation, but the fact is that we do have to show resolve. I think the European community has stepped up and made commitments to do some things that they have never done before. The sanctions that we passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee the other day are very biting, one of a kind. We've never done this before, where economic extortion and corruption are part of those, and I think this is a major, this will be a major miscalculation on behalf of Putin if he were to move into eastern Ukraine. I don't think that's going to happen, but look, he's taken steps in the past where he's miscalculated, and again, I think us and Europe are showing tremendous resolve in countering this, and certainly it would be an huge economic problem for him if he were to do this.
Let me bring in Senator Menendez, because assuming, and I think it's almost certain, that Crimea does vote to break away, do you expect those economic sanctions, and talking particularly about freezing the assets of specific Russian and Ukrainian leaders who are involved in this, do you expect them to be imposed in the next day or so, even before Russia decides whether to annex Crimea?
Well, I think that the question will be, what does Russia do in response? And having those sanctions ready, whether it be against the defense minister, the Federal Security Service, the secretary of their Security Council, possibly the executives of Gazprom and Rosneft, which are their oil and gas companies, send a very clear message. Now, if Russia does enact it in the Duma and their Congress to go ahead and accept annexation, that's one thing. But if they move towards that goal, then I think ultimately the sanctions need to be enforced along with our European allies, because that will have the biggest bite.
Let me bring you in on this question of diplomacy and also the question of resolve, Senator Corker. On Friday, after 6 hours of talks between Secretary of State Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov ended without agreement, Kerry talked about sanctions, and then he said this.
We hope President Putin will recognize that none of what we're saying is meant as a threat. It's not meant as a, in a personal way.
Senator Corker, not a threat, not meant in a personal way. The invasion of Crimea started over 2 weeks ago. And you talk about resolve, but there really has been no action taken against the Russians up to this point. And here you have Secretary Kerry saying not personal, not a threat. Is the U.S. sending a message of resolve or weakness?
Well, look, there's no question that I think our administration has created an air of permissiveness, and it's those kinds of comments, Secretary Kerry and Lavrov exchanging gifts, and it just, I think that it's those comments that cause Putin to question what our resolve is. But I do think, again, as Senator Menendez mentioned, if Russia takes the steps, assuming the popular vote today is what we think, and that is that Crimea votes to associate, to become a part of Russia, and then the Duma does the things necessary to make that happen, we have to show long-term commitment to this, not some short-term prick, but long-term commitment. And no question, it will affect Europe, it's going to affect the United States, but without that, Putin will continue to do this. He did it in Georgia a few years ago. He's moved into Crimea, and he will move into other places unless we show that long-term resolve. So I do think the comment that Secretary Kerry made is not helpful. And again, it shows a wishy-washiness that we do not, as a nation at this point, need to show. We have commitments, and you know this. The Bucharest Memorandum said that we would protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. And our nation, along with Europe, the UK signed this also. We need to protect Ukraine. They gave up their nuclear weapons. And what does that say to nuclear proliferation? So this is a very important time for us. It's a defining moment for us and for Europe. And we need to be strong. We need to do it over the long term.
Senator Menendez, are we headed for a new Cold War with Russia?
Well, it need not be that way, but by the same token, from my own perspective, Putin only understands strength. He's an admirer of Peter the Great, which means that Peter was great because he added land to the Russian Empire. And so ultimately, what we do here, along with our European allies, has consequences as it moves forward for the Ukraine, has consequences for other Eastern European countries, some of which are now part of NATO, some of which are not, but were contemplated to be part of NATO. And also, Chris, beyond the Ukraine and Eastern Europe, is the message that we send globally. The Chinese are watching and saying, let's see what the West does, because ultimately we've got territory in the South China Sea that we believe is ours.
Senator Menendez,
and so others are going to look at that.
I hate to interrupt, but we are running out of time, and I want to ask you specifically about the message we're sending. Your committee overwhelmingly passed a bill this week, on Wednesday, that would impose new sanctions on Russia as well as give aid to Ukraine, but it wasn't passed, among other reasons, because there's a dispute with the House and with some Senate Republicans about reforms to the IMF and whether or not the IRS regulations of tax-exempt organizations involved with political activities should be delayed. I don't want to get into the details of that. I think what the real question is really in the middle of an international crisis, the Congress is going to get involved in all this inside politics?
Chris, really? The IMF reform, if you want to really help the Ukraine, is necessary. That's why we had a 14-3 bipartisan vote in the committee. That's why many senators, Senator McCain, Senator Corker, and others, I believe, are ready to vote on the floor with us to move that package, because you need to stabilize the Ukraine economically as part of the solution to the security threat. And only the IMF has the broadest reach and ability to do that.
But if that holds up action, Senator Menendez, is that wise?
I'm sorry? Is it
I say if that holds up action, is that wise, sir?
Well, listen, you can just send $1 billion in loan guarantee, which is significant. But at the end of the day, the House of Representatives did not even pass any sanctions, which we have in our legislation, which we believe are biting. So you can either have a fig leaf or you can have something robust and meaningful. That's what the Senate Foreign Relations Committee did. That's what's necessary to help the Ukraine. And the Ukrainian Prime Minister made that case to us when he was visiting.
Senator Menendez, Senator Corker, we want to thank you both so much for coming in today. Thank you, gentlemen.